So if you want to sign up for that, you can go to our website and find out, well, or write to me or call me. Just you need to sign up for this one. Okay, to get on with things now, I'm really pleased to invite Andrea Tuttle to come introduce our speaker for tonight. Andrea was here almost exactly a year ago, well, here in Zoom land, introducing Lori Wayburn from the Pacific Forest Trust, who also is talking about forestry of the new kind that we hope will spread. Okay, Andrea.
Hi, everybody. Let me put in another plug. Oh, okay. Let me put in another plug for the Van Eck trip. I've been on the board of Pacific Forest Trust for 18 years now, and you have a cameo managed forest just outside of Fieldbrook that incorporates all the good values that we care about and produces wood. So it's a nice trip, and you'll learn about land trusts and the land use and the special permitting that serves as an example for a special take permit. What's the name of the? A safe harbor agreement for owls and so on. It's a demonstration for us. So I want to put in a plug for that. So for those of you who know about forestry, and especially ecological forestry, that supports sustainability and biodiversity and native plants and watershed values and beauty, then you probably know Mark Andre. For those of you who have enjoyed the green canopy of the Arcata Community Forest, even while marveling at the wood and the revenue that it provides to the city of Arcata, then you can thank Mark. For those of you who have reason to deal with the regulations of the State Board of Forestry for approval of your timber harvest plans, or if you are a forest landowner developing a landscape management plan for your land, you may know Mark wearing that hat. Many of us know Mark for his 37-year career as the Environmental Services Director and City Forester for Arcata, but he also served on the State Board of Forestry for 10 years, which is a long time. He was appointed by a Republican governor and a Democratic governor. He served as eventually as vice chair and on many of the state board committees dealing with fuels management and forest health and forest carbon. Mark, one of the times that we particularly connected in our careers, Mark was a very early pioneer in forest carbon offsets, developing them using the California Forest Protocols, but then directing them to the voluntary market rather than the compliance market. And he was also instrumental in getting the State Air Board to include city-owned land as one of the eligible landowner classes. It was only private land before that. When Mark retired from the city in 2019, he was also named as the HSU Distinguished Alumni, having been a forestry grad. Mark is known for his steady, thoughtful voice in forestry, always with a view to management that is ecological and socially and economically responsible. Now he continues as a consulting forester with BBW Associates, and he recently helped write the McKay Tract Management Plan and the McKinleyville Forest Management Stewardship Plan. Mark has a terrific title for tonight's talk on how to manage forests to help maintain biodiversity and ameliorate impacts from drought and climate. So we are exceptionally fortunate to have Mark speaking on managing forests to blunt the force of the Anthropocene. Mark, the floor is yours.
Wow, That's pretty amazing. I think my talk is done. No, I'm really pleased to be asked to come here to CMPS, and thank you, Carter. Thanks, Andrea, for the great introduction. And I kind of was just kidding with that title at first, but it kind of stuck, so I just left it at that. And I think that's kind of what I'm going to frame my talk about, is my experiences around the state, not just with the city of Arcata, but over 40 years or so. I'm going to date myself a couple times here for sure tonight with some of these reference points. But yeah, really, I started out I worked for the Forest Service, the Inyo National Forest, after I left Humboldt. Cal Poly, Humboldt. Somehow it was much easier to transition to Cal Poly Humboldt from HSU than it has been for many people, including myself, to transition from CDF to Cal Fire, right? That took me a long time. But Cal Poly to Humboldt, it happened just like that. It's amazing. So I came back as a grad student in watershed management, and try to figure out my advancing of the slides here. Hold 1 second.
Do you want to do screen share?
Oh yes, I have to do screen share. Yeah. So you can see something else besides my face. There you go.
Make it full size.
Where's that?
Well, one is in the lower right.
Oh, that one. Okay. Slideshow. Give me a second. Thanks, Bree. Oh, slideshow. There it is. Okay. Great.
Now we just need that bar out.
How do we get that out of the way?
There is a way.
Just drag it. Right, just drag it up there. How's that? Okay. Now advancing the slides. It should just go down. No, sorry. That won't work.
Left or right arrows? Does that work for you?
Sure. Maybe I'll get this out of the way. There we go. Okay. Yeah. So lived and worked in the Eastern Sierra, Toyabe National Forest, Inyo National Forest. I still yearn for that kind of area where, especially when I'm crawling through huckleberry in the redwood forest, trying to find a carbon plot that was installed 12 years ago. And I know I'm within, 40 feet of it or so, but it still takes an hour to find it. So anyway, yeah, I lived and worked over there, and still has a big draw for me. But working on the Board of Forestry, I was able to travel around the state. That was the best part, was the field trips. And and this was my obligatory token, Jacoby Creek Forest flowering plant slide. After this, I'll warn you, it's mostly big stuff, big trees, a lot of dead trees, a lot of bug-killed trees, and there may be another flowering plant somewhere else in here later, but these were just taken actually real recently in Jacoby Creek. See Mitella, pink pond lily. Forget what that fungi is. But, yeah, before I went too far though, I just wanted to mention some early influences for me when I came to Humboldt. You can't see, I got to scoot this a little bit more. or put it somewhere else because you're not able to see everything. Hold on. I can't get rid of it, can I?
I know it's possible.
Get a more.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There we go. Okay. Okay.
Be sure to speak directly into the microphone.
Okay. All right. Also, some early influences for me. Dale Thornburg, Humboldt State forester, and Dr. Jerry Franklin, Dr. Rudolph Becking. You know, the thing about, Becking, ecosystems analysis class was pretty amazing because we had to like key out every bug in the soil, forest soil, and it was really meticulous. But his style of forestry was a little, kind of the Black Forest German tidy forestry, right? Jerry Franklin, University of Washington, but I was able to spend time with him in the field quite a bit. He was a buddy of Dale Thornburg's, and they backpacked in the marbles all the time, and the Russian wilderness with Dr. John O. Sawyer. So he was a big influence on me too about the time the Northwest Forest Plan was being drafted. He was key on that, and so was Dale, and I was able to hang out with him a lot, which was really cool. But Dale, his style, and these are all forest ecologists. I'm not a forest ecologist. I'm a dirt forester, really. But some of my best friends are forest ecologists, so I've enjoyed time with them. But Dale taught me about chaos and natural forest management, and no, it's not tidy in the woods. You gotta mimic windstorms. You gotta mimic fires. You gotta mimic natural disturbances. That's how you manage a forest, and it's okay if it's chaotic. Which I thought, yeah, I can do that. I can do chaos. I was attracted to that. So spent a lot of time with Dr. Thornburg, I should say. But one thing in common for all three of these gentlemen is in their careers, they had moments where they faced resistance in their professional fields, really to their ideas. And over time, though, they had a lot of influence. So early on, and this comes back, from learning about what restoration forestry is. I highlighted this because I'm going to go into, the whole Anthropocene issue, but I was taught, okay, you manage a forest to a reference point, the historic variability of how the ecological parameters of how that forest evolves over a long period of time. And that's changing now. And I'm going to talk about that as my main theme. And the Society of Ecological Restoration, that's their kind of definition of restoring and recovering an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And they're highlighted, to disturbance and resilience, but it's based on disturbances, this was 40 years ago or so, 30 some years ago, that we can kind of imagine in some span of time. Disturbance could be cultural fire, could be, usually in the redwoods, it was wind and fire and wildfire inland. So I was taught, if you're doing timber harvesting, you want to mimic a natural disturbance, keep within some kind of a reference point, and not push it outside of those parameters. For example, there's no, large scale clear cutting like in British Columbia, other places. There's no natural reference point for that, really. Removing that biomass, burning it, spraying it. So it was kind of outside of the range of variation you might expect. So Arcata's forest plan, we kind of wrote it at the same time as the Northwest Forest Plan, which was really for the Oregon, Washington, California, the federal BLM and U.S. Forest Service landscapes. But that was when I was kind of cutting my teeth on how to define what ecological forest management really was. Because when I started to work for the city of Arcata, a ballot measure got the city involved in forestry in 1979. That was before I worked there, but the ballot measure was to buy parks all over the city. Most of Arcata parks were purchased with timber harvest revenue from the Arcata Community Forest. But the caveat in that ballot measure was the city would practice ecological forestry. So it passed. I'm not sure what passed. You probably would pass still. But anyway, that's what got the city involved in managing its community forest. And, you know, myself and forest committee members, Dale Thornburg was one of them, the technical experts the city had for volunteers took that seriously. How do we define what ecological forestry is? So that's been kind of a, you know, career-wide or career-long pursuit of trying to figure out what that is. But basically, early on, we were looking at a reference point, like Lady Bird Johnson Grove or Prairie Creek, right? So we used a lot of the data, transferred it to the community forest. Okay, over time, if we have a long ways to go, but as we thin to get to a point where we have 110 trees per acre that might go to 20 or 50 per acre, like an old growth reference condition. But that's kind of how it was set up. And it was all about biodiversity, species and structural diversity, logs, snags, you know, down wood, and disturbance, which the surrogate disturbance for Arcata has been timber harvesting. So anyway, I tried prescribed fire many times in the redwoods and failed many times, although it might be easier now. Conditions are changing, but for a long time, people who've lived here a long time, which I know many in this room have, recall summers of fog drip. You know, it's definitely noticeable. It's a lot different. Is that just a temporary variation? Is that some permanent thing that is changing things? And, you know, from my experience, and I'll kind of give you a little tour of a few places in the state, even though I've 40-year forester's career is a little snapshot in time. You know, you observe things, you see trends, and then you read the research that's coming out. And, you know, that guy in the bottom right, this is where I date myself, Charles Keeling. He was the first one to start measuring CO2 in the atmosphere in Hawaii on Mauna Loa. And he worked at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Right before I transferred to Cal Poly Humboldt, you know, I went to a lecture of his, UCSD, and he laid out the whole prediction of, and this was the 70s, middle 70s. Oh, this is what's going to happen with the temperature on the planet based on our predictions. And that was a long time ago, and it's right on point, you know. So, but that really stuck with me, you know, that lecture. I think about it a lot, you know, and he became pretty famous, and he also faced a lot of pressure, you know, in his publishing, because frankly, it was fossil fuel industry didn't like what was happening. So the Anthropocene, that it's unofficial, really, unit of geologic time. We hear it a lot these days. It's probably going to be more official. But really, it's a point now in our history when human activity is now, you know, dominant force on ecosystems and the climate, to be contended with natural disturbances that we're used to, floods, fires, insect outbreaks. But it's really changed everything, and it's changed how we even think about managing or maintaining, you know, ecosystems going forward. pyrocene is something that's Stephen Pine came up with, but it's really similar. You know, it's characterized by humans' use of fire, burning fossil fuels, and the fact that we're having mega fires on a regular basis. So it's kind of the era of fire. So they kind of are similar. Another couple of reference points for me, you know, when I was first getting involved in forestry was Redwood Creek. You know, I had a job the summer before I attended Humboldt, and it was surveying the park boundary in Redwood Creek, which was called the Worm, you know, pre-expansion of the park. And I took that photo a couple of years later after the park expanded, when we were hired to help do some watershed restoration. So to me, it was pretty obvious what a resilient ecosystem under any climate regime was. The forest in Spain, where every tree was the exact same size, that went on forever, same species, plantation, large clear cuts that don't mimic a natural disturbance in any way. So it was pretty obvious to me then what was something I didn't want to strive for if the goal was, you know, ecological forest management. So these days, these are the three things we have to consider in response to climate change. Resistance, you know, that's defending high value places, and that may have a place in some cases. A big fire break or something to protect a real rare plant population or a key habitat or a listed species. But really, in the long run, that's like paddling upstream, the resistance approach, but it's appropriate in some cases. Resilience, that's improving the ability of an ecosystem to kind of deal with disturbance and stress. And I'll talk more about that later. Resilience. Ecosystems can be resilient, but not if they've been simplified or altered. Then they have a harder time to bounce back, spring back. And then transition from one type of system to another. And of all the places in California, and I'll talk mostly, it's really the Western US, we live in a place that's probably the least impacted in terms of currently and probably going forward in the future in terms of the redwood ecosystem, but it's not going to get by unscathed. So really, forest resiliency is what we hear a lot about, and there's a lot of money being thrown at, okay, we need to do something to California's forests, or they're all going to go up in smoke or fall apart, with climate change being the dominant stress. So sooner or later, got to decide to embrace it, right, and not resist it. You could do nothing, and that's a little dog hair plantation. That's the McKay Community Forest. And by the way, while I'm thinking of it, tomorrow night the County of Humboldt has a meeting, an online webinar to introduce their stewardship plan to the public about the McKay and where it's going in the future, which will be similar to Arcata Community Forest with a non-industrial timber management plan with the same ecological intent, but also to pay for itself economically. Because community forests really have the three things: ecological, top tier, social, and economic. They all have to work together really to work as a community forest. So anyway, be proactive. That's where we're going to talk about control, prescribed fire, fuel reduction, trying to make the forest be able to withstand, you know, certain events that maybe they can't currently withstand. And there's a lot of reaction after a big fire, whether it's, I've had a chance to tour a lot of them, and everybody wants to do something. And I just want to say there's a word that I don't like to hear about every single fire, because a lot of these fires, whether it's the August complex that burned from, Ruth Lake to Red Bluff, or the CZU fire, which I got to spend time in Santa Cruz County and San Mateo County, or Paradise, or in Plumas, people want to do something, politicians want to throw money at it and make it go away. And a lot of it's caused by poor land use planning, and I'll talk about that later too. But anyway, I prefer large, uncharacteristic large, or anything besides catastrophic, which there's no definition of that in climate science. It's kind of it can be a catastrophe if a town like Paradise burns. Yeah, definitely a catastrophe, but it's kind of being used for every single fire that comes up now. One thing, when I was on the board forestry, I was able to scrub it out of the forest carbon plan and the programmatic EIR for the vegetation statewide treatment plan, and just change the wording, because it's kind of a histrionic thing. It's not really a scientific thing. So anyway, I keep seeing it in grant applications, and I tell people it doesn't always work, and it's coming back into everything CAL FIRE's doing. So catastrophic wildfire, because fire's good, right? We need more fire. We have a fire deficit. That's one of the biggest problems out there. Okay, I think I mentioned this. We have to restore something, we have to rethink about future environmental disturbances, because there's really no analog in the past for us to be able to prepare in the future. Ruth Lake, Big Basin State Park, pretty much the entire 18,000 acres in Big Basin burned. So what can we do on the resilient side to kind of deal with change, any kind of change, and reduce stress? One is to grow larger trees, right? Larger trees, not only store more carbon, but they're a little more resistant to fires getting up in the canopies, compared to smaller trees or more stems per acre. To have larger trees, you can't have wall-to-wall trees, like, you have to have them spaced out. Prescribed fire, thin those dense stands, increase your buffers, especially, and your connectivity of forests to other places, so that species can migrate, and stock the seed banks. There are some seed banks, especially in Southern California, some of the peninsular range mountains that are really islands in the sky, where when they burn up and you don't have seed in the seed bank, it's really a tough thing to pull off restoration in those places. I was helping the water district, Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District, try to locate seed for a big seed zone in Trinity County, 312. It was part of the August complex, and the seed bank's tapped right now for that. So a lot of people couldn't get seed. Maybe next year there'll be some, but it's important for the state seed bank to have seed from a lot of genetically appropriate locations, and it's expensive, but it's super important going forward. So down the bottom there are just the definition of resilient, since we talk about a lot, is, rebounding, returning to the original form after being stretched, recovering readily from illness, depression, adversity, buoyant. So if you think about it that way, how can we manage land so that it can be resilient and spring back? One thing is to have larger management units and protected areas. There's a lot of criticism about big protected areas as maybe not being managed so that they're fire prone or they're problematic. But really, larger units and protected areas are super important because when it gets fragmented and you have a lot of development clutter out there in the landscape, it's really hard to do things like prescribed fire. And frankly, CAL FIRE spends a lot of their energy on fire suppression, protecting life and property when there's a big fire, because that's appropriate, but the watersheds don't get dealt with. So that's one of the reasons fires are larger, just because California has 35 million people and many of them live in the wildland urban interface. So resources go to protecting houses and structures. So I mentioned corridors and connecting landscapes and some management flexibility to try some novel strategies that I'm going to talk about in a minute. That's mainly thinking outside the box in a nutshell. So back on the land use thing, there's a lot of this in California, and I just put some quotes in there from some people I know, and I'll let you read them, but I better read them quickly for people who may not be able to see the screen. John Keeley from the USGS, we're not looking at a problem of just fuel accumulation, just population expansion, or just climate change. We're facing all three at once, and we're going to have to find ways to address all of them. And Edith Hannigan, Board of Forestry Executive Officer, who's a planner, a land use planner, actually. I think the first time the executive officer of the Board of Forestry wasn't a forester, so it's great. She's great. She says, on top of the intrinsic risk of simply existing in the WUI, the wildland urban interface, these communities must now contend with the effects of years of drought, bark beetles, onslaughts on surrounding forests, climate change, which create increasingly dangerous and untenable living conditions. And a retired Captain David Shrew, he says, wildfires aren't a fire department problem. They're really a land use and community design problem. And the solution is to respect natural systems and stop developing communities in the wildland urban interface. For those communities already there, it's important to incorporate better planning and design approaches to reduce the danger. So, we're talking about climate change and forests and managing forests, but the wildland urban interface and land use planning probably is one of the top tier things that are making it difficult to manage the land and difficult to deal with mega fires, frankly, because there's too many people, too much. So land use planning is a big deal. A lot of people think, well, we got to do everything. Triage is really it. We got to think about not just resiliency, but maybe even mitigation, which is not my favorite thing, but expanding forest areas is one way in the world you can do that. Plant more trees to soak up more carbon. I mean, these are efforts to mitigate climate change using forests. Forest carbon projects. The city of Arcata has 3, and Van Eck has 1. I mean, there's a lot of criticism maybe about whether they actually are benefiting the atmosphere. It's a one tool. It's a way. It's a way for a landowner to possibly an incentive, I guess is the right word, to manage the forest, to mostly grow big trees and to store more carbon per acre. And they have a place in the mix. And using more wood products definitely helps. They're having embedded carbon in durable wood products is a real thing. That's the structure there from mass timber. And yeah, I hope Cal Poly Humboldt, I think they're looking at some of their new construction projects using the mass timber approach. We're seeing a lot in many other places. So that's the mitigation. That's probably not the most important thing, but the forestry sector in the last few years in California has turned into an emitter, you know, from a net sequestering, you know, category of forestry and forests. It's become a net emitter. A lot of it has to do with the fires we've seen lately. So, so the current situation with grants is that there's a lot of money right now to do projects, and for botanists, archaeologists, foresters, there's not enough of them to go around right now to help enable projects. Workforce capacity is not up to the task it needs to actually deal with the amount of acres in California that need to be, I'll just say treated, you know, with prescribed fire or thinning. Just to get many of the forests back to a point where they can be maybe managed to be resilient a little bit. But there's a real need to increase the scale of things because repeated fires we're seeing are reburns, I'll say, are causing ecosystem type changes to occur. They're actually in the Klamath Mountains, the marbles. That region is one of the areas where you can actually see what used to have frequent fire of maybe 10 or 15 years, low intensity, is now having high intensity, wind-driven fires on a frequent basis, so that they're not conifer forests anymore, not likely to be. And infrastructure is important to deal with woody biomass and logs, you know, for thinning as necessary. Lately, I've been working with a 7-county outfit called the North Coast Resource Partnership, and their whole strategic plan is aimed at trying to direct priorities for investments in forest health, forest treatment. So that's been a real fun thing to be involved in, and they are active in this county, I should say, and all the way to Siskiyou County, trying to work with National Forest. It's a big task to try to lay it all out there in a strategic way, but they're being real successful in partnerships, especially with county governments and tribes and federal agencies and state agencies. So at the end of this, I'll mention that again, because the strategic plan is going to, I think, help direct things, so it's not a scattergun approach. Right now, the state receives grant applications all over the place, and there's no real prioritization. Yeah, so most of them are getting funded right now just because there is so much money and there's such a need to deal with things. So Southern Sierra, probably of all the places I've been to lately, has been hit the hardest. And really, if you look back, like that photo in 1917, that the west side of the Sierra was pretty open. You know, it wasn't dense. It wasn't dense with conifers like it is now, which is a result of fire exclusion for, you know, 100 years basically. So really the reset button is been hit down there in terms of mortality. I mean, it's one thing to have a drought, the driest succession of years in 1,200 years. That's not good. But maybe the forest, when it was in an open state, could have dealt with it a lot better than in a super dense state. So you have fires and bug kill, and it's an example of probably forest area we're gonna lose, and we're gonna lose some carbon, but that's probably the way it should be. You know, for a while, after every field trip the Board of Forestry went on, whether it was Ventura or to Mountain Home State Demonstration Forest, or the Boggs Forest in Lake County, or in San Diego, like 2 weeks after we had our field trip and board meetings, the place is burned up. It was to the point where let's not go anywhere for a while, just because this is not working. So you would think a 2,000-year-old tree like the one on the right that's dead, you know, could deal with a fire, but it didn't. It's dead, and it's you can see the measures in Sequoia National Park they did for certain iconic trees to kind of get them through, you know, extreme heat, extreme dry events. The two on the top, I wasn't able to go back and take, but those are before the fire. That's Mountain Home Demonstration Forest, a really cool place in the southern Sierra. Back to coastal redwood forest. This is the southernmost grove. There might be one more that's maybe 10 miles, but this is pretty far down there. And I've been able to go here a few times over the past few years. These are coastal redwood, about 3,000 feet, that aren't looking so hot. And it's from drought stress, predominantly a sudden oak death, and just primed to burn again, frequent fire. So, but it shows you how resilient that species is. You know, we live where we live, doesn't have anything close to the stress that Big Sur has in terms of redwoods, but they persist. There they are. But that's where we're seeing at those ecotones, those range edges, you know, climate change kind of exerting the biggest and most drastic changes. You know, Big Basin State Park is pretty interesting. Santa Cruz County, I was able to go down there last year and help with BBW and Associates assess trees for removal. Cal Recycle somehow is in charge of debris removal through the OE, Office of Emergency Services, and FEMA. And they brought in arborists from all over the country to assess trees to be removed within, you know, certain distances of county roads or public roads and houses and towns. And they were tagging almost every redwood tree because they had zero foliage on top because they had crown fired. And then we came in and started pulling all the tags off. And we're getting flack from Cal Recycle and the contractor, who was getting $3,500 per tree, because when they put out the the request for proposals for this debris removal and hazard tree removal, people just flew over the county, right, and just kind of estimated, oh, this many miles of road, everything's dead down there. But the amazing thing about coastal redwood, you know, we have the data sets because we kept those files, and hardly any redwood trees actually died. The ones that did were maybe 12 inches or mostly 10 inches or less, you know, small diameter trees, or larger trees that were near where a structure had burned and had that big thermal, you know, heat effect. That killed some of the older trees, but it was pretty amazing because every single Douglas fir that I could see in Big Basin State Park and most of the county died from the fire, and all the tan oak And you know, that's a pretty resilient place. But when you think about Big Sur's humidity is a lot different than Humboldt County. And every degree in temperature increase, air holds 7% less water vapor. So think of a 3-degree increase, which is predicted for us, and what that means on humidity, relative humidity, and the ability for air to hold water. So could it happen, a fire like that here? Maybe it's someplace like Bull Creek, but we have to anticipate that. The trees came back, they took a beating, and now they'll have no competition from other species for a while. So they'll probably, you know, have a big growth spurt once they put their canopy back on. I threw that picture in there just because it was kind of weird, but after a big fire, you find a lot of things that are typically you wouldn't see in the sword fern or the huckleberry or the understory. And there was a whole bunch of old growth stumps that burned that were loaded with booty, silver. And I thought I found pirate treasure for sure, because it was this was not far from the coast, and I won't say where, but it was pretty, I think it was some Bonnie and Clyde thing they traced back to, you know, many decades ago. But we, you know, you find a lot of archaeological evidence too after fires. There's an example, and I spoke too soon in terms of the redwoods in Big Basin State Park that died because not from fire, but many of them broke off, or their structure was to the point where the bark or the cambium was so thin that a windstorm snapped them off. So there are quite a few that died from that. That's basically a structure thing and not a outright mortality from the fire. But a lot of Doug fir, 40 to 80 inches, all of them died. Coffee Creek, this was just a year ago. And this is where we're seeing reburns and type conversions becoming a problem. But really, that fire has a lot of mosaic green, and there's seed sources, and you know, it's not going to be probably the end of the world there. That fire probably wouldn't have been such a big deal, except for the backfires that were set that actually took out way more land in fire than maybe should have. But oh yeah, this is being recorded. Sorry. But that's what my intel says from that one. And that was mostly to protect some cabins and houses, which, like I was saying earlier, you're going to protect houses and life and property as the primary thing. But in this case, the backfire, you know, burnt into the wilderness and took out a lot of old growth, and probably wouldn't have burned. It probably would have burned, like creeped along like it was doing. But, you know, back to the Mad River watershed, our drinking supply, there's Ruth Reservoir, and that was the August complex. That this is actually 2022, so it's being reforested. And I just want to talk a little bit about the new way of thinking of, you know, before it was default was they call it pines and lines, just plant 10 by 10 spacing after a fire as fast as you can, get them back out there. But no, now these days you don't want to recreate a forest that's not very resilient, and a pine plantation or any kind of conifer even age plantation is the most, like the early slides I showed, too simplified of an ecosystem to weather stress. So there's a lot of new guidance out, and on ridge tops, just plant sparse or plant clumps, you know, maybe more dense in the concave lower slopes, the moisture slopes, and skip some areas, and you know, try to mimic a natural forest that's not 10 by 10 spacing, and recreate a problem. So that's not that easy to instruct to crew that way. So it's going to take more art to reforest these areas. I just had to say, I mean, in Bend, Oregon, that's a roundabout sculpture. You know, they honor the tree planter, you know, but the ones I know feel more like the guy on the right. So, which I was one of them once upon a time. So reforestation, this happened just last month. This is on a private parcel next to the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District. And like I was talking about, we were trying to get them to plant lower density or spatial heterogeneity, try to emulate the forest, not the one that we were looking at. The dead forest was pretty wall to wall, you know, even aged, but creating some skips and gaps to make it a little less vulnerable in the future. Just a couple things that people are interested in. The Forest Carbon Plan came out in 2018, and that kind of lays out the statewide strategy for trying to manage landscapes, forested landscapes with a changing climate. And a lot of what's in there is directing where investments are being made now. That includes conservation easements, it includes key land acquisitions, it includes maybe taking a look at some regulations too, to make projects a little more viable. But it's not about log our way out of the problem at all. It's a thoughtful plan that can be amended, but it kind of lays out what the baseline is, what the expected future impacts are going to be. And it's really important for the state to be able to monitor, and they are now, mostly through an array of forest inventory analysis, or FIA plots, that are arranged in the state. I was fortunate to be able to inspect those years ago, and got to go to visit every national forest except the Angeles. But those are permanent plots out there, and they're kind of the pulse. They're taking the pulse on the carbon budget of California's forest. And you would expect a flux in carbon, of course, with time. You know, it pulses, and like big fires come, big fires go. But for a long time, the carbon, up until recently, was showing a real net benefit, a net positive. But it's kind of like dropped because of a couple large fires recently. So, and I just put that save the date thing on because I just got that like yesterday in an email. It's reforestation strategies for the Southern Sierra Nevada in the era of climate change symposium. So a lot of effort to kind of figure out things, and in this era of climate change, it's affecting every agency, every landowner, and how to manage forest land, because there's no toolkit, there's no direct guidance, but there is a lot of information, and a lot of it has to do with creating more resilience in the forest, first priority. So a couple of big questions, and I know this group would be really interested in talking about number two. We could talk about that for the whole evening, but number one is, typically prescribed fires aren't set in wilderness areas. I mean, most large wilderness areas are let burn if you have a natural fire, right? Lightning, let it burn, and they burn out of the wilderness and sometimes into towns, and that can be a problem. But fire suppression has led to a lot of fuel buildups, and should we actually go into wilderness areas and do prescribed fire projects in them? There's disagreement about that one. Number two is, should we really loosen up our notion of rethinking seed zones and assisted migration, especially where there's no real connections of landscapes or islands, like I was mentioning before. right now, not too many people I know are thinking, oh, let's take seed zone genetics from the south in Sonoma County and Mendocino, move them up to Shasta Trinity. People are talking about it a lot. A lot of geneticists and forest ecologists who 10 years ago would say no way have changed their tune on that one. So in the past, people kind of went up and down maybe by 500 feet elevation because the seed banks and the seeds that are collected are kept tracked by certain seed zones that were maybe, and they're being updated, but they're created in the 40s, I think, and elevations to try to make sure you aren't just flinging genetics all over the place, because, and species all over the place, because in Humboldt County, we're still dealing with aerial seeding of knobcone pine, for example, and Monterey pine and eucalyptus. People thought were good ideas, and those are invasive, and they cause other stress to the ecosystem. So anyway, those are two big questions. Maybe if we have time at the end, we can take some questions about that. That's the only other flowering plant I have left in this one. But so near term, we want to try to restore at least a portion of the landscape to native plant community composition. And there is an effort with the state's 30 by 30. Anybody hear of that? The 30 by 30 governor proclamation and Natural Resources Agency push in California to protect 30% of the landscape, of the natural landscape by the year 2030. Right now, I'm hearing it's 24%. So there's, 6% more to go. So, and the coastal wetlands are part of that picture too. So this is the Arcata Community Forest, and since 1981, this is what we've been trying to do. Extending the rotation age, larger, more stable trees, reduce mortality, abundant understory vegetation, and more carbon. So it's been a long-term experiment. When I go to the McKay Forest and see a much younger version of this with no understory in many places because it's so dense, the light can't hit the ground. You can kind of visualize how that can evolve. It could evolve on its own, take a long time, or it could evolve quicker with some help. On the lower right, Redwoods Rising is a big project in Humboldt and Del Norte, in the state parks and the national park, to thin that logging legacy clear cut of dense, even age stands. And actually a lot of aerial seeding went on there too. So a lot of effort there to thin in the national parks and state parks to just nudge those forests along to evolve quicker to an older growth or kind of later sterile structure. But there is different than Arcata or McKinleyville or the McKay. In those parks, they're doing it one time, pulling the rows, that's it. It's a one shot kind of a thing, as opposed to that upper photo, Jacoby Creek Forest, that's a thin, and the plan to come back 30 years and thin again. That lower left is the Arcata Community Forest, managing for big trees, wider spacing. That was thinned 2 years ago. So that's an ongoing thing, as opposed to what they're doing in the park, but it's the same ecological intent, basically. Plug the Arcata Community Forest again, but just because it's so near and dear to my heart. And I wanted to mention that there's a lot of interest in this model. I mean, the Arcata Forest is small. It's a postage stamp, really. It's 2,500 acres. It used to be, it's doubled in size in the last 20 years. But to me, that during my time there, I remember certain things, like once getting a phone call from a company in British Columbia called Macmillan Blodell. They're not there anymore, but they had 2 million acres, I think, in British Columbia. And they were in a panic because they were locked out of the European lumber market because they weren't FSC certified, Forest Stewardship Council certified. And they found out the city of Arcata was. They called and they said, their head forester said, our CEO's on our case. We gotta change our direction fast. And they're basically massive clear cutting, even age kind of plantation style thing. So they came for a visit. I go, yeah, we'll give you a tour. Well, they came the next day in a Learjet to McKinleyville, and they had like 9 people get out. And I'm like, wow, you came to our little forest, and it just showed, wow, that's the power of a little example. But there's a lot of interest in community-based forestry, mostly for the recreational use and the kind of the urban limit lines, open space attributes, but also in terms of working forests that have an appeal and ecological management intention. In Weaverville, a different model there. It's national forest land that the federal government is allowing the local folks to manage on behalf of the local community. So there's a few different models out there. But there's a lot of interest in this one. And again, I think tomorrow it's 6 p.m. for the McKay Community Forest. So they were looking for Arcata's lessons learned to help them get off to a good start. I mean, there are some good things happening. It's not all doom and gloom. Mostly it's doom and gloom. Climate change to me is like, whoa, you know, I'm glad BBW has some young talent. Bree's here to keep me honest. But the challenges they have, you know, it's like 3-dimensional chess trying to manage forests without the extra stress of climate change is not easy, because you have to have such a long-term view. You know, it's not like short-term kind of a commodity or something. So now you have to look long-term, 100 years, and you know, are the conditions today going to be the same as they will be in 100 years? And the answer is no. We're not getting our act together, really. It's not happening, you know. People like Dr. Keeling in 1970, earlier than that even, but when I heard him talk at Scripps in 1975, they were like saying, this is going to happen. Here's the hockey stick, you know. Yeah, it happened. So I want to be kind of more optimistic, and on a local level, there's a lot of good things, especially where we live in the Redwoods. And there's a lot of political will to do something positive, but I guess we just have to expect the climate change. You got to, you know, just embrace it and not resist it. See how you can manage with it. This is a map of the Jacoby Creek watershed, by the way. It's talking about a good thing. And it's a partnership of a lot of agencies, and the city, we want to expand this partnership for sure, especially to include local tribes and co-stewardship, co-management, and more involvement there. But the areas in green are the city's Jacoby Creek Forest, and the red was acquired 2 years ago, and the blue was acquired 4 years ago from Sierra Pacific, and the kind of olive green was acquired with the city's effort and Cal Poly Humboldt to kind of block up that upper watershed. So really, there's an opportunity there to do some science. For example, Berkeley and the other Cal Poly well, the San Luis Obispo Cal Poly have their own forests and are able to, utilize areas for long-term research. And of course, the Arcata lands are available for that. And there may be some more land available soon. In fact, there's 80 acres there that we're looking to help expand the university's forest for a place to train future foresters, future biologists, future botanists. And it was fun to put that sign up. That's my daughter right there. So she was going to go into the medical side of biology, but she called the other day and said she wants to switch to ecology. So I don't know how that happened. A good friend of mine is a climate scientist that I rely on, and she retired, but she spins out so much, she produced so much information that was of interest to me, and I printed just one of her papers to give out to the first person who puts their hand up. But limber pines, wild ride with climate, up, down, and all around. But it's 4,000 year history of what in the Great Basin, what limber pine has been doing, and the deadwood is still there, really showing that species. Anybody into the Great Basin? Okay. And another term, pyrosilviculture, resilience in the dry western states. Well, we don't live there, but somebody may want this paper too. So I just wanted to also say, it's really hard to predict the future, but in my little short period of time, even though I heard about what was coming, it maybe didn't seem real, but now I've been able to just, the research is pumped out that and the evidence is out there that forests are in trouble. And here's a few resources some people may download on their own, but there's a new California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force that the governor put together. They meet, and it's kind of the leading edge of where the efforts in California are going for climate action related to forestry. And I put the carbon plan up there too, if anybody wants to download that. And the other one is, yeah, that's the Forest Management Task Force's website. So you can attend their meetings, or they were in Santa Rosa last week. And look online. CJ, you looked at your watch. Am I at that point?
Yeah.
I think so. Okay. All right. Let me get the people back from this sidebar.
If you ever stop share, you
Oh,
go
the red one.
see the red one.
Not quite.
Right below that.
All right, hold on.
Okay. Got it.
Hey.
Got it.
Okay.
There's probably time for questions. I know I didn't talk about the Board of Forestry that much, but
Anybody who needs to leave can leave without feeling guilty. And if you're on Zoom, put your questions in chat.
oh, I see 11. Okay.
You're
Yes.
in charge.
I know there's a lot of people that aren't aware of the benefits of fire and or system, or even the benefits of the timber industry, and they think that those are all bad things.
Yeah.
And cutting down a redwood tree would be considered evil. In the Arcata Community Forest, when you do thinning, do you run into resistance from certain levels of population? doing that?
Not so much, except maybe a newcomer who maybe had moved to the forest or to the town and bought a house on nearby on the edge and just wasn't familiar with what was going on there, assuming it was a park, right? Because maybe they came from an area where parks are parks, not working forests, like, because it's an unusual model. But from the citizenry that lives here, it's rare. It's really rare. But it's, I'll tell you, the city has 3 tracts: the Sunnybrae tract, the Jacoby tract, which is the biggest now, and the core Arcata Community Forest, which was purchased for water supply years ago. The use there is, we haven't had any incidents, for 30 some years, but we don't close the forest. We escort people around the active timber operations. They get to see them up close, but it's getting stressful, just the numbers of people there. Recreation is during a live timber operation. So, as the town population goes up, that'll be a challenge for the city, how to operate, try to get in and out as fast as possible. So
It's not so much protest.
it's not protest about cutting the trees. It's more of, oh, it's inconvenient because I had to wait to be escorted past the yard or the log deck or something like that. So, yeah, Ken.
Do you view bears as friend or foe in your efforts to manage local forests?
Be sure to repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. The question was, do I view bears as friend or foe in terms of forest management? Bears, if only we could train them to girdle trees, every other one or something. But there's you can't, and it's more of a problem in younger, fast-growing plantations, even age management. But the city does group selections that mimic a little blowdown in a gap, canopy gap, and trees will grow. It's fast-growing, producing sugars that the bears, which is a learned behavior by the bear. It's just background noise, basically, So I'm not too worried about it. Barred owls, though, they're foe. Yeah.
I'm curious if, your experience with the city of Arcata and Humboldt County, you feel like the city planners here and the local politicians have this understanding of kind of the defensible space and the fibers of the culture that you mentioned that we need to be doing around our community in order to protect it?
Yes, in this county, there's a lot of fire safe councils, and the county of Humboldt, is kind of a big leader with the North Coast Resource Partnership in trying to communicate that. It doesn't always translate, in my opinion, to the planning commissions, right, that approve developments in the wildland urban interface or on natural resource zone lands. So I think every fire that happens, they find there's a forensic thing that happens, right, with structure fires. And wow, they had their firewood up against their house, or they had a lot of vegetation up against the house, or they had their fuel tanks right next against the house. And so everybody's trying to learn from that. The county has to file a fire safety element periodically in their general plan, and the Board of Forestry reviews and approves those. And CAL FIRE looks at all the aspects of access and safety, but it's a lot better, I think, in terms of people understanding why defensible space is such an important thing. And there are a lot more exemptions. I didn't go into regulations too much, but even doing a restoration project or a fuel treatment project, I mean, we still have CEQA. You still have to do botanical surveys, biosurveys, and you still have to do it right. I'm not going to call that a bottleneck, but it's, it's as more projects are done, the state of the art improves, and there's more capacity, which in the past, it's kind of a dangerous thing to just use a few years of grants to try to create an industry on, because then budgets go down and it's hard to sustain, you know, things. So this has to be a sustained effort from here on, no matter what the political winds are, or, you know, we'll fail to do what we need to do. Yes.
You spoke to the urban wildfire interface a bit in your talk, and I'm just curious if there's any transition now, because in my experience, I have some family in Southern California, so the Thomas Fire was big, and you have this big fire come through and destroy a lot of residencies. And the response, in my opinion, in some of these places tends to be more oriented around a lot of funds going back into rebuilding. I was wondering if there's any transition now to thinking about these spaces more as, well, that's an area where there was a really high interval probably historically, and how much are we just building in the wrong spaces, and should we be refocusing those funds elsewhere, putting them more into management, or just kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, my personal thoughts, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, rebuilding on the Outer Banks of North Carolina after a hurricane, right? Or floodplains in the Mississippi, and it's a hard one. Insurance companies are making it a little harder to rebuild. I mean, I think maybe rebuilding is going to happen in those places because they own the land, but how you rebuild and how fire resistant the structure can be is going to probably make it be a bigger deal. And I was just driving through the Fountain Fire Scar last week north of Santa Rosa, and it's mostly being rebuilt on a fire shed that burned in 1960. The same thing happened there. So it's pretty understood, and that's where the land use planning, you know, has allowed things that shouldn't have happened, shouldn't have occurred, but they're there. So what do? You make it as defensible and robust as you can by the building materials, and then do your vegetation work, you know, so that you can weather that next inevitable, you know, wind-driven fire that's going to blast through there. So those are the lessons learned. But to rebuild without, you know, safe, resistant building materials, I think it is pretty foolish. And I don't think insurance companies are going to be able to deal with that in the future. But I think it's a hard one to say, everybody out of here. But I think there's been 1 million houses built in the wildland urban interface in the last 10 years. A lot. It keeps happening. But there's challenges with CEQA now that are being upheld in terms of high intensity fire prone areas, like big subdivisions that are getting denied. So people are recognizing that might not be the smartest place to sprawl to. Yeah.
I'm very interested in your response to that question there.
Yeah, I'm just going to. Okay, the question is, there were
It was incredible this year.
storms along 299 towards Willow Creek where the trees were all snapped mid-trunk. Most of them were oaks, I believe, hardwoods. And I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
But you see extension foresters tell me they don't think that was the case, you know. But it's a curious thing because those trees have had snow loads on them before, wet, heavy snow. And why did it happen? Why did so much breakage and damage occur in December? Yeah.
We had an incredible amount.
So, so was there a physiological stress in the tree that shut it down more? But a lot of those were in the shady riparian areas, and they weren't probably that, you know, drought stressed, you know. But I heard that. I haven't heard a good answer,
Okay.
except no.
Someday.
Yeah.
So about these seed banks, are they collecting, like who collects the seeds, and are they trees, are they shrubs, wild, everything? And could we plant could communities gather the seeds, and then we plant those seeds also in our own communities to kind of.
Yeah, it's always a good idea to have seeds in storage for areas that could be maybe blown away in one single event. I'll say fire. It's not always fire,
Is it
but
just tree seeds they're collecting or all?
yes, tree seeds. And I was trying to get incense cedar from the seed bank, and there was none, because typically those aren't the ones that people buy. But we're going to have to look at stocking the seed bank, and it's a cost. We'll have to invest in it with a whole diverse array of species.
Can there be communities that come together and collect seeds?
Certainly, yeah. But right now it's collected by contracts, typically, but yeah, there's a lot of ways to collect seeds, especially oaks. But I didn't show any pictures of oaks, but all the live oaks down in Big Basin mostly sprouted from the base. And same with like out Upper Mad River, all the black oaks and white oaks have resprouted. So, okay, somebody wanted to ask, can you speak more about how the state may change traditional seed zones and new species? Yeah, mostly driven by research at UC Davis and forest geneticists who are looking at changing the seed zone map. And I expect in the next year or two, we'll probably see something. That there are some new online tools that actually allow someone to pick a geographic location and look at a climate predicted future there to do your seed zone collection or seed zone kind of assignment. So there are some new tools. Anybody can email me after and I can send them that link. Andre2391, I forgot to put that on at gmail.com. But there are some new developing tools for looking at the future of a particular area. And it's not like the temperature just increases everywhere the same. There are some places where like species are dropping, where you have cold air cooling in canyons and things like that. See if I can pull another question off here. Okay, I see. Good night. Good night.
Another question over here.
What additional species would you include for reforestation? I mentioned incense cedar. Basically, you want to mimic what's there naturally, and not push the limits with something that's not native to a watershed.
Here's one more question.
Oh, and then the May issue of National Geographic, which I picked up today, is titled "Saving the Forest." Anybody seen that? It's pretty amazing, actually. So I just picked that up at Northtown Books. Yvonne.
I was struck by your mention of the Weaverville Community Forest, and I think you said the Forest Service is allowing the community to manage that. And I was wondering if, and maybe I misheard that, but I was just wondering if the community didn't step up to do that management, who would do it? And could you say something about the role of the federal agencies, particularly the Forest Service? Because they're going to have a huge amount of forest in California, and they have their boots on the ground have shrunk very, very precipitously over the last 20, 30 years, really, since the Northwest Forest Plan. So where's the federal government in all this with all the land that they manage?
Yeah, well, the federal forest plans that are coming out are different now. I mean, they have an ecosystem kind of driving theme to them. But you're right, their resources, their staff aren't able to match the challenge that's needed out there, and they transfer a lot. So you don't have people in a lot of places that hang out long enough to get to know an area and network. So that's where the communities and through things like stewardship contracting, long-term contracts, the federal government can give to an entity or a community to achieve certain objectives over time, not just one budget cycle, but it's got to be like a 10-year period. I think that's the best bet for making progress. I mean, the federal lands, you know, you have to go through NEPA, you have to do everything, and it's not always easy to be nimble. You know, like the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District is way ahead in the Mad River. The Forest Service is a partner, but they're doing their work too, and they'll get there. But there's too much budgetary shifts from year to year, really. But I think there's a lot of new tools. The shared stewardship agreement with the state funds actually being used on federal landscapes on the upper Scott River right now. Their state funds are going to be used for mountain meadow restoration and field treatment, where the conifers are encroaching on meadow complexes from fire exclusion. So, not that California should bail out what the federal government should be doing, you know, with its lands, but right now it is in some cases when their budgets aren't there to match it. By the way, there's a community forest grant through the USDA that has $2 million nationwide to the state just, I think, awarded like $80 or $90 million last week, you know, for projects. So California, in a lot of ways, is leading the way on trying to address climate change. I mean, our state has the most diverse geographic specialized ecosystems and forest types and elevational changes by far compared to a lot of other states. So it's climate change is a lot trickier here than it is in Vermont, maybe, although they have their own stresses, right, from warming and issues with native trees, but it's really tricky here, just due to the it's a fire adapted ecosystem, but is it adapted to weather another 3-degree increase and shortened seasons? Yeah, it'll adapt, but there's going to be winners and losers, mostly losers in terms of situations like the Mojave Desert never used to have fire, but now it has invasive cheatgrass, which burns if you just look at it. So they're having issues there they didn't used to have. I'll make sure I get to all the questions before we wrap it up.
I'm going to invite everybody who's here with more questions to come up to.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we can start.
Good night to our friends on Zoom.
I want to put it on.